Clint Eastwood sat alone in a quiet diner, sipping his coffee, the rim of his hat casting a shadow over his sharp, weathered face. The place wasn't fancy, just an old roadside spot where truckers and travelers stopped for a warm meal. He liked it that way, simple, peaceful, but that peace was about to be broken. The door swung open, and a group of young police officers walked in. Their uniforms were crisp, their confidence high, their voices a little too loud for the quiet setting. They had just finished their shift and were in the mood to unwind, maybe crack a few jokes at someone's expense. One of them nudged the other and motioned toward Clint, a smirk creeping onto his face. "Look at this guy," one officer whispered, just loud enough for others to hear. "Some old cowboy sitting all by himself. Probably thinks he's in a movie or something." They chuckled, their voices filled with arrogance, not realizing or caring who they were talking about. To them he was just an old man in a dusty jacket, another relic from the past. Clint didn't react. He stirred his coffee slowly, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. He had faced tougher men in his life, both on and off the screen. A few smug officers weren't enough to rattle him. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s, shot the young officers a warning glance as she refilled Clint's cup. "You boys should show some respect," she said in a firm voice. "You have no idea who you're talking about." One of the officers scoffed. "Yeah, and who exactly is he supposed to be?" Clint remained silent, taking another sip of his coffee. But then, just as the tension thickened, something caught their eyes, something on the table right next to him. Their laughter faded, their faces slowly changing from amusement to shock. They weren't looking at Clint anymore. They were staring at the small, leather-bound folder resting beside his cup of coffee. The name on it sent a chill down their spines. And in that moment, they realized they had made a mistake. A big one. The diner grew quiet. The officers, who had been laughing just moments ago, now stood frozen, their eyes locked on the leather-bound folder beside Clint's coffee. One of them, a tall officer with sharp features, swallowed hard before finally speaking. "No way," he muttered under his breath. Another officer, younger and clearly nervous, leaned in to get a better look. The name embossed on the folder's cover was unmistakable. ***, Clint Eastwood ***, not just a name, but a legend. The man sitting before them wasn't just some random old cowboy. He was the Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood icon, the man whose movies had shaped generations, whose tough guy persona had inspired even some of them to become officers in the first place. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Clint simply lifted his coffee cup to his lips, his movements slow and deliberate. He had seen reactions like this before, people recognizing him too late, after their words had already left their mouths. He didn't need to say anything. The weight of their mistake was settling in all on its own. The waitress, who had been watching the entire exchange, gave a knowing smile and shook her head. "Told you boys," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You never know who you're talking to." One of the officers, the one who had started the teasing, cleared his throat and forced a nervous chuckle. "Mr. Eastwood," he said hesitantly, trying to recover. "I didn't realize. We didn't mean any disrespect." Clint finally looked up, his piercing eyes meeting the officer's. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something about his gaze, something steady, something knowing, that made the young officer shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You boys always judge people before you know 'em?" Clint asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir." Clint nodded slightly, setting his coffee cup down. The leather folder remained untouched beside him, its presence a silent reminder of who he was. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They had come in feeling invincible, full of energy from their shift. Now, standing in front of a man who had played some of the most legendary lawmen on screen, they suddenly felt like rookies again. And as the tension hung in the air, they couldn't help but wonder, what else did Clint Eastwood have to say? The diner felt different now. The once loud officers had fallen silent, their laughter replaced by uncertainty. They had walked in with a kind of confidence that came from a badge and a gun, but now, standing in front of Clint Eastwood, they felt something else entirely: respect, maybe even a little shame. The officer who had first mocked Clint cleared his throat again, forcing himself to meet the older man's gaze. "Yeah," he said, though his voice wasn't as steady as before. "We want to know." Clint studied him for a long moment, then let out a quiet breath. Without a word, he turned the paper around and laid it flat on the table. The officers instinctively leaned in, their eyes scanning the page. And then, everything changed. The smirks were gone. The cocky confidence had evaporated. Now, all that was left was disbelief. One of the officers blinked, as if trying to make sure he was seeing it right. Another let out a low breath, shifting uncomfortably. It wasn't what they had expected, not even close. The paper was official-looking, its header bearing the emblem of the *** police department ***, and right there, printed in bold letters across the top, was something none of them had been prepared to see. **Körpermendation for Service ***. Beneath it, Clint Eastwood's name was printed in crisp, black ink, and below that, a detailed description of an event that none of these officers had ever heard about, an act of bravery, something that had happened years ago, long before any of them had put on a uniform. The officer closest to Clint finally found his voice. "Wait, you." Clint nodded slowly, his fingers still resting on the edge of the page. "Long time ago," he said. "Before Hollywood, before all this." His voice was calm, steady, but there was something heavy beneath it, something deeper than just words. The realization settled over them like a wave. They had walked in thinking Clint was just an old man with nothing left to prove. But the truth was, he had once worn the same badge they did. He had once stood in the same shoes, faced the same dangers. And the fact that they had dismissed him so easily, it hit harder than any lecture ever could. The officer who had first mocked Clint swallowed hard. "Sir, I had no idea." Clint shrugged, glancing down at the commendation. "Like I said," he murmured, "people see what they want to see." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. And then, just when they thought they had wrapped their heads around it, Clint reached for the folder again, because there was one more piece of paper inside. And this time, when he pulled it out, their stomachs dropped. Whatever they had expected, this was worse. Much worse. The officers barely had time to process what they had just learned when Clint slid the second paper onto the table. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he knew exactly what kind of reaction it would get. The young officer closest to him hesitated, then leaned forward to read it. His eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat. He nudged the officer beside him, who took one look and stiffened. It wasn't another commendation. It wasn't an award or a piece of recognition. It was an *** letter from the police department ***, and this time it wasn't about something from the past. It was dated just *** 2 weeks ago ***. The officer who had been the most vocal, the one who had laughed at Clint when they first walked in, felt a chill crawl up his spine as he read the words. The letter was formal, direct. It was addressed to Clint Eastwood and signed by the chief of police himself It was an offer a request for Clint to serve as an honorary consultant for a high-profile case involving the department, a case that, from the wording in the letter, was far from over. The officers looked at each other, their faces pale. They had assumed Clint was just some retired actor living off his past. But the truth was, he wasn't just sitting in this diner reminiscing about the old days. He was still connected. He was still respected at the highest levels of law enforcement. And if the department was reaching out to him it meant one thing. Whatever case they were dealing with was *** serious ***. Clint let them absorb it all before finally breaking the silence. "Funny thing," he said, his voice steady. "I almost didn't take the meeting. Figured I'd have to deal with a few cocky officers who think they know everything." His eyes met each of theirs, the weight of his words settling in. "Guess I wasn't wrong." The officers shifted, embarrassed, but before they could respond, Clint tucked both papers back into the folder and pushed his coffee cup aside. He stood up, adjusting his jacket, his presence somehow larger than it had been when they first walked in. As he made his way toward the door, he paused beside the officer who had spoken the most. He didn't say anything right away, just let the moment hang between them. Then, with a slight nod, he muttered, "Respect's a two-way street, kid." And with that, he walked out, leaving the officers sitting in stunned silence. The door swung shut behind Clint, the small bell above it jingling softly. The officers remained seated. Clint didn't need to say much. His presence alone carried weight, a lifetime of stories etched into the lines of his face. He had spent decades portraying the kind of men these officers had once looked up to, tough, principled, fearless. And yet, they had dismissed him at first glance, writing him off as just another old-timer. The officer who had first mocked him shifted on his feet. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I grew up watching your movies. My dad used to put them on all the time. Dirty Harry, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've seen them all." Clint gave a slow nod, stirring his coffee. "Your dad teach you to respect people too?" The officer looked down, exhaling through his nose. "Yeah, he did." Another officer, one who would stay quiet during the teasing, finally spoke up. "If you don't mind me asking, Mr. Eastwood, what brings you here? Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find a Hollywood legend." Clint glanced around the diner, the faded booths, the hum of an old jukebox playing softly in the background. "Places like this, they're real. No cameras, no scripts, just people." He took another sip of his coffee. "Besides, I like my coffee black, and I don't need some fancy cafe charging me $10 for it." The officers chuckled, the tension easing slightly. But one of them, one who hadn't spoken yet, kept staring at the leather folder on the table. Something about it didn't sit right with him. If Clint had just been here for a quiet cup of coffee, why did he have that with him? "Sir," the officer finally asked, his voice careful, "that folder, is it something important?" Clint glanced at it, then back at the young man. His fingers tapped against the table once, twice. The air felt thick again, like something unspoken hung between them. "Depends on what you call important," Clint said, his voice even. The officers exchanged glances. They had come in thinking they were the ones in control, but now they weren't so sure. And the longer they stood there, the more they realized there was more to this night than just an awkward encounter in a diner. Something else was at play. And whatever it wasn't over yet. The air in the diner felt heavier now, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on everyone at the table. The officers had come in feeling like they owned the room, but now, standing in front of Clint Eastwood, they weren't so sure of anything. And that folder, the one sitting right next to his coffee, was still the biggest mystery of all. The officer who had asked about it couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just some ordinary folder. Something about the way Clint had responded, the way his fingers had tapped against the table, made it clear. Whatever was inside, it meant something. Clint let the silence stretch, watching them with that same unreadable expression. Finally, he exhaled slowly and reached for the folder. His fingers rested on it for a second before he slid it a few inches closer to him. The officers tensed, eyes locked on the small but strangely significant object. "Funny thing about people," Clint said, his voice low and deliberate. "They see what they want to see. They decide who someone is before they even know a thing about them." The officers didn't dare interrupt. "I've spent my whole life watching folks do it," Clint continued. "And tonight, well, you boys did the same thing." He lifted his eyes, letting his words sink in. "Judged me before you knew me. Wrote me off before you had the facts." The officer who had first made fun of him shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his colleagues. None of them had anything to say. Clint let a small smile touch the corner of his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's a dangerous thing to do," he said. The officer closest to him cleared his throat, still eyeing the folder. "Sir, what's in there?" Clint let out a small breath, tapping his fingers against it once more. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted the cover just enough to pull out a single piece of paper. The officers leaned in slightly, their curiosity getting the better of them. But before they could see what it was, Clint turned it over, setting it down with the text facing him. For a few long seconds, he just stared at it, his expression unreadable. Then finally, he looked up at the officers, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "You sure you want to know?" he asked. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Whatever was in that folder, whatever Clint Eastwood had been carrying with him this whole time, was about to change everything. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The way Clint held the paper, the way his expression darkened just slightly, sent a ripple of tension through the air. He wasn't just playing games with them. This was something real, something that mattered. Still processing everything that had just happened. The diner, which had felt so ordinary when they walked in, now seemed like the setting of something much bigger, something they would never forget. The officer who had laughed at Clint the most let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair. Well, that just happened. The waitress, who had been silently observing the whole exchange, smirked as she poured another cup of coffee for a trucker at the counter. "Told you boys," he said. "You never know who you're talking to." One of the younger officers, still staring at the door Clint had just walked through, shook his head. "I can't believe it. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood was almost one of us." The officer next to him, the one who had been skeptical from the start, sighed. "More like he still kind of is." He gestured toward the folder that had held the letters. "The department still respects him enough to ask for his help. And here we were, treating him like some washed-up nobody." A heavy silence settled over them again. They had spent the night thinking they were the ones in charge, that they knew everything. But in just a few minutes, Clint Eastwood had flipped their whole perspective upside down without even raising his voice. Finally, the officer who had been the most vocal, the one who had taken the first jab at Clint, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. "Man," he muttered, "I feel like an idiot." The waitress chuckled as she walked by. "That's 'cause you were." The other officers couldn't help but laugh, even though the truth stung a little. They had learned something tonight, something more valuable than anything they'd picked up at the academy. Respect isn't just about the badge. It's about experience, wisdom, and knowing when to shut up and listen. As they finished their meal in thoughtful silence, one of them glanced out the window. Clint was already gone, disappeared into the night like one of the characters he had played so well on screen. But his lesson, that would stick with them for a long, long time.